Good morning. For a change, I have no jokes, no funny slides, but this is a far more serious topic than my normal observations of the Texas legislature, right? This really is an important topic, and I think we often focus so much on the day-to-day operation of our districts that it's easy to forget the big picture. The important role that MUDs play in the growth and development of the Texas economy. I want to first thank AWBD, its trustees and staff for putting together this program and AWBD's larger effort to educate and inform the general public about MUDs. This association's response to recent media criticism about MUDs has been spot on. Join me in applauding the trustees and the staff who've led this effort. It's really been great. Texas has experienced continued economic and population growth that is unrivaled across the nation. People are moving to Texas in record numbers, and they are finding a healthy economy and a vibrant housing market when they get here. Leaders and pundits alike marvel over the Texas miracle, largely understood to refer to our state's phenomenal ability to create jobs and allow our economy and population to grow and develop. However, the Texas miracle could never occur and would not be as successful if Texas weren't able to produce a steady supply of new, affordably priced housing supported by quality public infrastructure. This is the MUD contribution to the Texas miracle. Affordability of housing remains at the heart of explaining the continued success of the healthy Texas housing market. Texas has avoided the volatility in real estate markets experienced in other high-growth, high-population states. This, again, is the MUD contribution to the Texas miracle. James Gaines, who's chief economist of the Real Estate Center at Texas A&M University, said, MUDs have been crucial in allowing an adequate housing supply and keeping home prices lower than in other high-growth states. Without MUDs, new home construction would be severely limited and much more expensive. He goes on to say that without MUDs, Houston would probably be another very high-cost housing market similar to major markets in California. MUDs allow developers to supply housing to appropriately meet the housing demand. Meeting housing demand with adequate housing supply yields stable housing prices. If the supply is lower than the demand, housing prices rise, making home ownership unaffordable and putting your tax bills all up. The cost of infrastructure can greatly curtail a local government's ability to support necessary and desirable growth. Existing residents of a community may not desire to pay the cost of extending new utilities to new homes. In this sense, many cities are unwilling or unable to fund new infrastructure for new home construction. This is where MUDs come in. MUDs allow growth to pay for itself. MUDs allow growth to pay for itself. The use of MUDs to develop infrastructure is not new. Far from it, in fact. Constitutional authority for the modern concept of MUDs dates back to 1904 and 1917, when Texas voters approved amendments providing authority for the creation of conservation and reclamation districts. By the mid-20th century, MUDs had become the most important tool for home builders where no water and wastewater infrastructure was provided. Though the model has evolved over the years, the core function of MUDs remains the same. MUDs induce developers and home builders and their banks and investors to invest private capital in public infrastructure. This bears repeating. MUDs induce developers and home builders to invest private capital in public infrastructure. As Steve discussed, the developer assumes all of the financial risk in a MUD. The developer pays all of the upfront costs to design and construct the infrastructure. If the developer performs by developing a subdivision with stable property values, then the MUD will reimburse the developer. It is this promise of MUD reimbursement, if the developer performs, that entices the developer to invest. No other form of local government and no other model for developing infrastructure harnesses investment of private capital the way the MUD model does. This is the public-private partnership of MUD financing. This public-private partnership model of MUDs extends to MUD governance as well. As everyone here knows, elected board members who own property or who live in the MUD govern the MUD. A MUD is a government body governed by public officials. But MUDs operate much differently than other forms of local government. MUD operations more closely resemble a small business than a government. A typical MUD does not have employees, and as a result, there are no pension, labor, or health care costs to the MUD. As there's no office to maintain, overhead costs are low or non-existent. In lieu of employees, a MUD board contracts with professionals who can be hired and fired at any time. These professionals bring expertise and productivity from the private sector and put it directly to work for the MUD. MUDs build legacy infrastructure. You create water, sewer, drainage to serve future generations. You don't create legacy liability, pensions, and other employment liabilities that you leave to future generations. In this sense, MUDs take the best from the private sector, private financing and business-like operations, and couple it with sound principles of open government and responsible regulation. Many people describe MUDs as the most regulated form of government in Texas. MUDs are highly regulated at the local, federal, state levels. Starting from creation, a MUD must receive consent from the city with jurisdiction. Cities are allowed to condition that consent to create a MUD, and they almost always do. Typically, a city requires that the utilities are designed and constructed to city standards, and that the plans and specifications of those utilities are reviewed and approved by the city. This results in high-quality, environmentally correct utilities. Cities also typically approve MUD bond issues or prescribe the parameters within which the MUD bonds can be issued. On the federal level, tax-exempt MUD bonds are regulated by the IRS, and federal security regulations apply to the trading of MUD bonds. Of course, state law is at the heart of MUD regulation, and the TCEQ is the state agency with primary jurisdiction. The TCEQ has a broad and extensive role in the oversight of MUDs, and Julie's described a lot of that very important role. Of course, MUDs are subject to a myriad of state laws and regulations. All of the open government requirements that you would expect of local governments also apply to MUDs. Open meetings, public information, conflicts of interest and ethics disclosure, and many more. These open government requirements are fair and reasonable and good. Open government ensures accountability. I've worked with many MUD boards over my career, and all of them share a fundamental desire to be open and accountable to their customers and their taxpayers, who are also their neighbors and friends. But where does this openness and accountability begin? Does it begin with the initial MUD election? There's a great deal of misunderstanding about initial MUD elections. Much of the criticism of MUD elections is born out of this misunderstanding. And because some people are critical, we often avoid discussing the topic. So let's talk about MUD elections. First, let's start with some facts. The Texas Constitution requires that MUD taxes and bonds be authorized by the voters at an election. Texas law and the Texas Constitution provide that residents, not landowners, vote. You vote where you live. Our initial MUD elections are designed to meet these legal requirements. They also comply with all requirements of state and federal law. The elections to approve MUD taxes and bonds must be held before development begins. Why? Let's go back to one of my earlier points. MUDs induce developers and home builders to invest private capital in public infrastructure. The centerpiece of that inducement is the promise that the MUD will reimburse the developer if the developer performs. That promise cannot be conditioned upon the future passage of an election. Would a developer invest in a MUD if the MUD bonds and taxes necessary for reimbursement had not already been authorized? No bank would lend a developer money under those circumstances. I believe that no one in this room would invest money under those circumstances. A new MUD is created over raw land. No one lives there. The elections have to happen before development begins, but only residents can vote. It sounds like a logic puzzle. But the system of initial MUD voters we have is designed to solve this puzzle and fully satisfy the law. It is also a system that has worked well and has survived scrutiny for generations. A model of only a few MUD voters approving taxes and bonds sounds unfair. It sounds undemocratic. But it's not unfair and it's not undemocratic. But the fact that it's unusual leads the misinformed or the uninformed to criticize. How can I say that initial MUD elections are fair and democratic? Simple. MUD homebuyers are well informed. MUD homebuyers know that they are buying a home in a MUD, and they know that they are paying the cost of their utilities through their MUD taxes. Cynics underestimate people, and they underestimate people's intelligence. Buying a home is the biggest consumer decision most people will ever make. People do not buy homes lightly, and they do not buy homes uninformed. The centerpiece of this information is the MUD notice to purchaser. Every home buyer is given a detailed notice of the MUD and its taxes and its bonds at two crucial points in the process, once at the earnest money contract and once again at closing. Why is it fair for a handful of voters to approve MUD bonds and taxes? Because every homeowner is given this detailed notice of those bonds and taxes before they buy the home. This is the crucial point of transparency. It does not matter how many people voted in the initial MUD election if every homeowner is informed. 2 people could have voted, or 100 people could have voted, and the result is the same. Everyone moving into the MUD does so with full and complete information. MUD residents vote with their feet when they move into a MUD. There's one other aspect of MUD bond elections that's important to understand. A MUD bond election merely authorizes bonds to be issued in the future. The bonds are only issued under very specific conditions. It is absolutely false to equate MUD bond authorization with MUD indebtedness. Such conclusions are the hallmark of bad reporting. MUD bonds can only be issued if and when development within the MUD supports the bonds. And MUD bonds will only be issued to pay the actual cost to design and construct MUD infrastructure. As we all know, the MUD bond authorization is based on reasonable estimates of future costs, and those costs in actuality are often lower. Most importantly, the decision to issue those bonds is made by the MUD board. There's so much more I can say. If you can't tell, I'm passionate about what we do. I'm often allowed to serve as a spokesperson for MUDs, and I love it. I am so proud of what each of you individually do with your own MUD. And together, those of you in this audience, those of you who are members of this association, you are making Texas a better place to live. You are allowing Texas to grow and flourish. Families own homes, quality homes, bought at affordable prices in beautiful neighborhoods, supported by high-quality utilities because of the work you do. Everyone in this room should be proud. Everyone in this room should be proud of the MUD model and should be willing to discuss it openly and honestly. MUDs are good for Texas. MUDs are great for Texas. God bless Texas, and God bless Texas MUDs.